What kind of woman pays cash for the ugliest building on the prettiest lake in 3 counties, moves in with an 8-year-old and a dead woman's recipe tin, and spends her whole first month tearing the inside apart while the outside keeps falling down around her? The people of Wexford Shores had answers for that. The Property Owners Association had a lawyer on retainer. Somebody had already called the county twice, but not one of them ever stopped to wonder why she kept the shades drawn and the work lights burning past 2 in the morning, or why the little girl carried the same dented tin box from room to room like it might float away, or what she was uncovering under 50 years of wallpaper that somebody a long time ago had gone to a great deal of trouble to bury. They decided she was the problem. They were wrong about that, the way people in a place like Wexford Shores are so often wrong, with confidence and casseroles and a printed agenda. Every beautiful place has the one lot nobody will touch. In Wexford Shores, it was the little cottage at the dead end of Loon Hollow Road, a gray box of a thing with its back to the water and its face to the street, as if it had decided long ago not to look anybody in the eye. The cedar siding had silvered and split. The porch sagged on the lakeside where the posts had rotted at the footing. Lake grass had come up through the gravel walk, and the dock out back was 3 planks short of safe. Everything else on Loon Hollow gleamed. The lawns ran down to the shoreline in clean green sheets. The boathouses were painted the same approved shade of slate. The mailboxes stood at attention. This was a community that loved a rule the way some people love a hymn, and the man who wrote the rules was Roland Cabot. His father, Augustus Cabot, had built Wexford Shores out of marshland and old farm parcels back when the lake was just a lake and not a brand. Augustus was dead now, but his name was on the entrance sign and the boat launch and a brass plaque at the clubhouse, and Roland had inherited all of it, including the office of association president, which no one had ever run against him for because no one had ever imagined doing it. Roland was a careful man, soft-spoken, the kind who could deliver bad news in a tone so reasonable you'd thank him for it. His wife, Glenys, handled the rest. Glenys knew which families were behind on dues, whose marriage was quietly ending, whose grandson had been picked up by the sheriff that one time. She kept all of it in her head like a ledger, and she had a gift for making sure her information reached exactly the right people while her own hands stayed clean. So when the rust-pocked pickup turned onto Loon Hollow that first Saturday in October, Glenys was the one who saw it. She stood at her bay window with a mug going cold and watched a woman climb down from the cab. The woman was tall, maybe 45, a black woman in a paint-spattered canvas jacket and steel-toed boots, her hair wrapped in a faded blue cloth. She moved like somebody who had carried heavy things for a living, slow and square-shouldered, and when she looked up at the wreck of a cottage, she did not look the way a buyer looks at a fixer-upper, all calculation and dread. She looked at it, the way you look at a face you've been waiting your whole life to see again. Her name was Odessa Frame. The passenger door opened and a girl slid out, 8 years old, hair in 2 careful puffs, a green dress over leggings, and pressed to her chest with both arms was a tin box the size of a loaf pan, its lid stamped with a pattern of wheat sheaves, worn nearly smooth. The girl, Goldie, stood very still on the gravel and studied the cottage. Then she said, not quite to her mother, "It's the one in the photograph." Odessa rested a hand on the back of her daughter's neck, picked up a duffel with the other, and walked her up the broken steps and inside, and the door closed, and the shades came down, and that was the last clear look most of Loon Hollow Road would get into that house for a long time. Within the hour, Glenys had made her calls. She didn't have to say much. A new owner at the Frame place. Cash, the agent said. No bank, no inspection, no contingencies. A check and a handshake for a property that had sat dead on the market for 2 summers. The fastest closing the agent could remember. That single fact moved through Wexford Shores like a dropped match. If a woman like that had that kind of money lying around, the thinking went, why on earth would she buy the worst house in the development and leave it to rot? Only one neighbor crossed the street. Audrey Sams, who lived 2 doors down and was getting on toward 70, carried over a foil pan of corn pudding and knocked. Odessa opened the door 6 inches, enough to see her, thanked her with real warmth and a tired smile, and said they were settling in fine, no need to fuss. Not cold, just closed. Audrey walked home turning it over, and what stuck with her was the one thing the rest of the street missed. The new owner hadn't so much as glanced at the peeling siding or the rotted porch she'd just walked across. She'd stepped over the broken board out of habit, like a woman who already knew exactly where it was. For the first 2 weeks, Odessa did not fix a single thing anybody could see. She didn't mow, she didn't paint, she didn't shore up the porch or pull the grass from the walk. Instead, the truck made trips and came back loaded with the wrong materials altogether. No shingles, no exterior stain, but pry bars and putty knives, drop cloths and box fans and clip lights, and she carried every piece of it inside. The curtains stayed shut. But at night, the cottage woke up. Light leaked yellow around the edges of the windows until well past midnight, and sounds carried across the still lake air, the slow shriek of a nail coming out of old wood, the dry scrape of plaster off lath, the occasional measured tap of a hammer, never frantic, never fast. She wasn't gutting the place, she was peeling it, one careful layer at a time. New drywall came down to reveal old paneling. Old paneling came off to exposed plaster, gone the color of weak tea, and under a final skin of yellowed wallpaper in the kitchen. Where the steam of 1,000 mornings had loosened the paste, something showed through that made Odessa stop and sit down on an overturned bucket and press the back of her wrist to her mouth. Words. Handwriting brushed straight onto the plaster in a careful looping hand, faded but legible, a recipe for soft molasses bread. Beneath it, a line of scripture. Beside that, in a child's blockier letters added later, in a different decade, somebody had practiced writing their own name over and over, climbing the doorframe like a vine. Goldie watched her mother work every evenings, sitting cross-legged on a tarp in the cleared-out front room with the wheat-sheaf tin open in her lap. Inside were index cards and folded sheets gone soft as cloth, recipes in that same looping hand, a few small black and white photographs, a pressed sprig of something that had once been blue. Goldie would lift a card, then look at the wall where the writing was coming clear, comparing the letters the way a person checks a photograph against a face. One night, Odessa worked a strip of wallpaper loose near the pantry, and there it was, low on the wall at the height of a kneeling child. A careful little drawing of a hen, and under it, in the careful loops, the words Cleo's Girls, fed and counted, 1961. Goldie got up and walked over and laid her small fingers flat against the hen. "Dad's grandma drew this," she said. "Your grandma, when she lived here." It wasn't a question. Odessa set the putty knife down on the sill. She looked at her daughter's hand on a hen her grandmother had drawn 60-some years before either of them drew breath, and her eyes went hot and bright. But she didn't let it spill. "That's right, baby," she said. Goldie nodded once, like she was filing it away with the other true things she knew, then went back to the tarp, closed the lid of the tin, and held it against her chest. Glennie's Cabot's phone, meanwhile, did not rest. The story she built needed no facts in it, only a shape, and the shape was easy. A woman working behind drawn shades half the night, a truck full of who knows what, strange comings and goings on a quiet street. She never opens those curtains, Glennie's would say, letting the sentence hang. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying we keep an eye out for each other here. One neighbor, emboldened, called the sheriff's office about late-night noise. Everyone understood what the call was actually about. A black woman and a little girl alone in a house in a place where no family had ever looked like theirs. 2 deputies came out at 9 on a Tuesday. Odessa met them on the porch, calm, the work light throwing her long shadow down the steps. She showed them the deed with her name on it and a county receipt, and, through the open door, her daughter at a folding table doing fractions. The deputies found nothing, apologized, and were gone in 8 minutes. But the cruiser had sat at the end of Loon Hollow, with its lights washing across every pristine window on the street, and in a place like Wexford Shores that picture was a verdict, no trial required her. The smaller cuts came after. At the market out by the highway, Goldie stood in the school supply aisle running her thumb along a tin of 48 colored pencils while Odessa was a row over choosing flour. A woman from the development, one of Glennis's circle, found the girl alone and bent down with a frown of pretend concern. "Are you lost, sweetheart? Where's your mama?" 2 other children stood unattended at the end of the same aisle, white children, and the woman hadn't blinked at them. Goldie looked up with an expression far too old for 8. "She's right there," the girl said, and pointed, and turned back to the pencils as if the woman had already gone. 30 days in, Roland Cabot came to the door himself. He wore a navy quarter-zip and carried a manila folder, and his smile was the practiced kind, friendly enough to seem like a welcome, firm enough to remind you who set the terms. "Mrs. Frame," he said, hand out, "we're glad to have new blood on the lake. I'm sure you understand Wexford Shores holds itself to a certain standard. We all do our part." He handed over the folder. Inside was a notice of violation, 9 items: overgrown lawn, failed siding, hazardous porch, an unpermitted dock, the lot. She had 60 days to bring the property into compliance or face fines and a hearing before the board. Odessa took the folder without opening it. She looked at Roland Cabot for a long moment, not with heat, not with fear, but with a steady, almost gentle recognition, the look of a woman seeing precisely what she'd come a long way to see. "I understand, Mr. Cabot," she said. "Thank you for bringing it by." He nodded, pleased, and walked back down the cracked path to the Range Rover at the curb without once looking back. Odessa stood in the doorway until the taillights swung off Loon Hollow. Then she went inside, locked the door, and pulled out her phone, and opened a folder of files she had been building for the better part of 2 years, scanned and photographed and sorted. A quitclaim deed from 1968, stamped with the seal of Cabot land and title. A county tax sale notice mailed to an address the family had already been forced out of. An appraisal that valued 11 acres of lakefront, the family's 11 acres, at less than the price of a used tractor. Odessa Frame had known who the Cabots were long before she ever wrote that check. She put the phone away, checked on her sleeping daughter, and got back to work on the wall. That night, after Goldie went down with the tin tucked under her arm, Odessa sat alone in the half-stripped kitchen, with her grandmother's handwriting glowing pale all around her, and the memory came the way it always came, without knocking. Cleofa Frame in the back bedroom of a rented house, 2 counties over, 91 years old, paper-thin and clear-eyed to the last. She had taken Odessa's hand in both of hers, and her grip had no business being that strong. "I baked bread in that kitchen before I could see over the table," she'd said. "My daddy raised hogs on that land, and my mama sold pies off the porch to the summer folk. We owned it free and clear. And the year your great-grandfather got sick, the Cabot man came around about back taxes nobody could ever show us a bill for. Said he'd take care of it. Said sign here. Daddy couldn't read but a little, and he was proud, so he signed, and by spring we were gone, and the surveyors were out there with their flags." Her voice didn't break. It had stopped breaking decades ago. Folks said we lost it. We didn't lose anything, child. Losing is when you're careless. We were robbed in the daylight by men in good shoes, and then they made us feel like fools for it the rest of our lives. She'd reached under her pillow then and brought out the wheat sheaf tin and pressed it into Odessa's hands. "Everything I could carry out is in here. The recipes, my mother's letters, the paper that proves what was ours. It's for the baby now." Her thumb had pressed hard into the back of Odessa's hand. "If you ever get the chance, you take Goldie home. Let her stand in that kitchen. Let her know we were never small. We were just made quiet. She hadn't finished the next thing she started to say. But Odessa had nodded and held the tin and made a promise she meant to keep no matter the cost. Now, sitting in that very kitchen, Odessa understood the cost completely. The Cabots wanted her gone. The street watched her every move. The sheriff had already stood on her porch. And somewhere under the floor of the back pantry, where her grandmother had once said the strong box went down with the foundation, the proof of all of it was waiting to be lifted into the light. She had a choice, and she knew it. She could fix the siding, mow the lawn, satisfy the notice, keep her head low, and finish her grandmother's kitchen over years, quietly, an old woman's house brought slowly back. Or she could let the street talk, ignore the folder, and dig for what mattered and take whatever came. She picked up the pry bar, walked to the pantry, and knelt down on the cold boards. She chose to stay quiet a while longer, not because she had nothing to say, because when the time came to say it, she wanted every single word to land. Quiet in Wexford Shores was never really quiet. It was the sound of people deciding things about you in rooms you weren't invited into. 3 weeks after the notice, Glenny's hosted what the printed invitation called a Lakeside Standards and Safety Social, wine and a cheese board and a stack of handouts, and every household on Loon Hollow got one except the cottage at the end. 26 people came. Glenny's stood at the front with her glasses low on her nose and never once said Odessa's name. She didn't have to. "We've all noticed the activity at a certain property," she began. "Odd hours. An unfamiliar vehicle. We've already had the sheriff out. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm simply saying that in a community like ours, awareness is the same thing as caring." She proposed 2 new security cameras, one on the streetlight directly across from the cottage and one on the boathouse next door, both angled, as it happened, to take in Odessa Frame's front door and back dock. The vote passed without a single hand raised against it. Audrey Sam sat near the back and did not vote at all, and stared at her wine, and that night she did not sleep well. The cameras went up the following week, and the porch was now a stage with a permanent audience. Some mornings Odessa would find junk mail in her box addressed to occupant or no name at all. Twice the lawn care company she hired drove to the gate and turned around without explanation. The fine notices arrived on schedule, neat and impersonal, and still, every night the work lights burned, and the grandmother's words came clearer on the walls, and the boards in the pantry came up one at a time. Under the third one, Odessa's bar struck metal. She cleared the dirt by hand and lifted out a rust-blistered strongbox the size of a Bible, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had held against 60 winters, were the originals, the genuine deed in her great-grandfather's name. A surveyor's map with the 11 acres marked, and folded smallest of all, a single sheet in her grandmother's young hand, a list of names. Other families, the Emises, the Tatums, the Boudrias, 4 households along this same shoreline, each with a date beside it, each gone within the same 2 years, each from the same kind of paper signed by the same kind of hand. That list was the thing that changed it from a story about one stolen kitchen into something the whole county would have to look at. Odessa did not go to a lawyer first. She went to the library and then to a reporter. Dahlia Reyes covered the county for the regional paper, the kind of dogged, underpaid reporter who still believed property records told the truth when people wouldn't. And she spent 6 weeks with Odessa's strongbox and her phone full of scans and a borrowed table in the records office. She found the others. 2 of the original homeowners were dead, but their children and grandchildren were not, and when Dahlia knocked, the doors opened, because every one of those families had spent 50 years half believing the lie, that they'd been careless, that they'd lost what was theirs through some failing of their own. She found the pattern Augustus Cabot had run between 1966 and 1972. Tax notices that didn't match any assessed bill, quitclaim deeds witnessed only by his own employees, Appraisals he commissioned himself that valued lakefront acreage at a tenth of its worth. And in the county clerk's basement, she found one thing that turned the whole investigation from a sad history into a live wire, a 1974 deposition taken in an unrelated boundary suit and forgotten ever since, in which Augustus Cabot, under oath and apparently certain it would never matter, described his method for clearing the old families off the lake in language so plain it left nothing to interpret. The board hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the Wexford Shores clubhouse, the same room with Augustus Cabot's brass plaque on the wall. The association meant it to be brief. They would present the violations, move to assess the maximum fines, and pursue a forced sale of a property the owner had clearly let go to ruin, and be home by 8. Roland sat at the front table with the association's attorney. Glennies sat in the second row in a cream blazer. 20-odd residents filled the folding chairs, and Audrey Sams sat among them with her hands folded tight in her lap. Odessa came alone but for Goldie, who sat in the front row in her green dress with the wheat sheaf tin on her knees. Odessa carried one folder and took the chair at the petitioner's table and looked at no one. The attorney was efficient. 9 documented violations, a binder of photographs, a timeline of ignored notices. The camera's time-stamped footage of late-night activity, the petition signed by 22 residents. He asked the board to impose the full schedule of fines and authorize proceedings to compel a sale. When the chair asked whether the owner wished to respond, Odessa stood. "I won't argue any of it," she said, and her voice was level, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because she had lived all of it. The lawn wasn't mowed. The paint is gone. The porch isn't safe, and the dock isn't permitted. Every word in that folder is true. Roland Cabot eased back in his chair, and something close to satisfaction moved across his face. Then Odessa opened her own folder. "But before this board votes, I'd like to ask Mr. Cabot one thing." She turned and faced him directly. "Do you know who built the cottage at the end of Loon Hollow Road, Mr. Cabot? Before it was a cottage, before this was a development, when it was 11 acres of working land. The Frame family built it. They owned it free and clear for 40 years. In 1968, your father's company took it for $900 in back taxes on a bill no one in my family was ever able to see." The attorney was on his feet objecting. Roland's expression had not yet changed, only stilled. Odessa kept going at the same even pace, a woman reciting facts she had carried so long they'd worn smooth. "Odessa Frame was my grandmother. She was 6 years old when she painted a hen on that pantry wall, and you can still go look at it tonight because I uncovered it last month under your father's wallpaper. The land your father appraised at $900 was worth by the county's own survey that same year, more than I could say out loud without this room gasping, and my family wasn't the only one." She laid a single sheet on the table. Between 1966 and 1972, Cabot Land and Title took 4 other shorefront properties along this same lake from the Eames family, the Tatums, the Baudrillas, and one more, every one of them a black or immigrant family, every one of them for a fraction of its value, every one of them with paper that won't survive an honest look. She set her hand flat on the folder. "I'm not asking this board to rule on any of that tonight. That's not what this board is for. But I want it on the record, and Mr. Cabot should know that the county paper is running a full investigation this Monday. 4 of those families have given statements. There's a 1974 deposition in which your father described exactly how he did it, in his own words, under oath. The room had gone so still you could hear the lake against the dock outside. The attorney leaned in and whispered fast in Roland's ear, but Roland Cabot didn't move. He sat looking at the thin sheet of paper on the petitioner's table as if it weighed more than the entire clubhouse, as if it might pull the whole brass-plaked room down through the floor and into the cold lake mud, where his father had told the surveyors to set their flags. The chair called a recess that never really ended. The board adjourned without a vote, citing the need to review new information, and Odessa Frame gathered her folder, took her daughter's hand, and drove home to make grilled cheese on the same stove her grandmother had baked molasses bread on 60 years before. Dahlia Reyes's story ran that Monday, as promised, and it was every bit as thorough and as ruinous as the night had threatened. 4 families named and quoted, property records laid side by side, the assessed value next to the price Augustus Cabot had paid, so that no reader could miss the size of the theft. The 1974 deposition reproduced in full his own sentences, his own certainty. And above the headline, a photograph of the gray cottage at the end of Loon Hollow Road, the house where it had started, the house that was supposed to have been demolished and forgotten. What followed did not stay inside Wexford Shores. The county commission announced a review of Cabot Land and Title's old acquisitions. A foundation that worked on stolen land cases for descendants reached out to the Emezis and the Boudrias within the week. Roland Cabot resigned the association presidency in 3 days. The association's attorney quietly withdrew the petition against the cottage, and the violation notices simply stopped coming. Glenys Cabot, who had spent a season managing what the street thought of Odessa Frame, stopped answering her phone and stopped hosting socials. And the cameras on Loon Hollow developed a habit of being aimed by spring at nothing in particular. No one went to prison. Odessa had never once imagined anyone would. The men who'd signed the papers were mostly dead, and the law has a long memory for the wrong things and no memory at all for the right ones. But with the commission's review hanging over what was left of the Cabot holdings, the family chose to settle, rather than spend years watching reporters dig up more. The settlement brought money to the 4 families, and, more than the money, the thing they had been denied for half a century, a signed acknowledgement, on paper, that the land had been taken under fraud. The descendants who had grown up quietly ashamed, certain some grandfather had been weak or foolish or unlucky, were finally told in writing what Cleopha Frame had known in her bones and said with her last strength. They had not lost anything. They had been robbed in the daylight by men in good shoes. Wexford Shores did not become a kinder place overnight. That isn't the kind of story this is. A number of neighbors went right on avoiding the cottage, not out of suspicion now, but out of the more uncomfortable feeling of people who had signed a petition and voted for cameras and called the sheriff, and who now had to walk past house every day knowing what those small, reasonable choices had looked like in the light. Some of them would never say a word about it. Some never changed at all. That is the price of being right in a place that had built its whole pretty self on the agreement to look away. But a few came around, the way it tends to happen, in small things rather than speeches. Audrey Sams was first, as she had been from the start, and one afternoon she crossed the street again, this time with nothing in her hands, and sat on the mended porch steps for an hour while Goldie showed her the recipe cards from the tin, then a few others, a wave from a driveway, a package taken in from the rain, a short, real conversation at the mailbox that didn't feel like surveillance. One gray morning in March, Odessa opened her front door and found a brown paper sack on the porch with no name on it. Inside was a loaf of soft molasses bread, still faintly warm, baked from the recipe Dahlia Reyes had photographed off the kitchen wall and printed, without quite meaning to, alongside her story. There was no note, just bread, left by somebody who had decided that shame was a heavier thing to carry than a little plain kindness. Goldie found the sack when she came down for breakfast. She looked at the bread, then at her mother, and she smiled, and it was not the careful, braced half-smile she had worn since the day they pulled up on the gravel. It was the whole thing, open and easy, the smile of a child who has finally stopped waiting for the next bad thing to come through the door. By April, the kitchen was finished, and Odessa had finished it on her own terms. Every word her grandmother had brushed onto the plaster she had sealed and saved. the molasses bread recipe, the line of scripture, the hen, the child's name climbing the doorframe. She built a long open shelf where her great-great-grandmother's pie table once stood and lined it with Goldie's school books and a small framed photograph from the tin, Cleo Frame at perhaps 7 years old, standing barefoot in front of that same cottage, squinting into a camera held by someone who clearly loved her. The porch she rebuilt square and solid. The dock she had properly permitted, paperwork and all, because she did things right when right was the better weapon. But the front door she painted the deep, unreasonable blue of a thing her grandmother used to call morning glory blue. The color, Cleo always said, that the lake turned for about 4 minutes at dawn before the world remembered to be ordinary again. It matched no other door in Wexford Shores. It was never meant to. On a Sunday near the end of spring, Goldie sat on the floor of her bedroom, the room that had once been a little girl named Cleo's room, and opened the wheat sheaf tin one last time as a place for keeping old things. She took out the recipe cards and the soft letters and the pressed blue flour and the photographs, and one by one she taped them to the wall beside the hen and the climbing name, until the past and the present sat together on the same plaster. The last card, the molasses bread in her great-great-grandmother's looping hand, she set right in the center. Then, because the tin was empty, and she could not stand for it to stay that way, she took a sheet of paper and the tin of 48 colored pencils her mother had quietly gone back to the market and bought the day after the woman in the aisle. And she drew a house, a gray house with a morning glory door, a wide mended porch, 2 figures out front, one tall and one small, and a hen in the yard. She folded it once, laid it in the bottom of the tin, and closed the lid. The box wasn't a place for grief anymore. It was where the new things would start. Odessa Frame had not come to Wexford Shores for revenge. She came to keep a promise she'd made to an old woman who baked bread before she could see over the table, an old woman who wanted her great-granddaughter to stand in a particular kitchen and know exactly where she came from and exactly how strong the people she came from had always been, under all that enforced quiet. Revenge would have needed fists, or fire, or at least a raised voice. What Odessa used was older and slower and far harder to argue with. She used the truth, kept whole in a tin box and a strong box under the floor, and she set it down on a folding table in a room full of people who had spent years agreeing not to see it. And when the truth finally gets said out loud, plainly, by the right person standing in the right place, the thing built on the lie doesn't come down in a crash. It just quietly stops being able to stand. And behind it, in the dust and the daylight, you nearly always find that somebody planted something good a long time ago, and that it's been alive the whole time, down in the dark waiting for somebody brave enough to dig. If Odessa's story stayed with you, if it called up the face of someone you've watched be underestimated, somebody made quiet by people who should have known better, then maybe do this. Go look for the truth that's been sitting under the wallpaper in your own family, the deed nobody could ever read, the house somebody lost, the relative who carried a shame that was never theirs to carry. Ask the question out loud, and tell us in the comments below. Have you ever seen someone everyone wrote off turn out to be the one person in the room who was right all along? Stick around because every week the quiet ones win here, one true word at a time.